after I started receiving questions on the first video on the subject of these early Bosch electric fuel pumps, I realized I didn't answer all the questions, and there was some vagueness in some of the things I said. So I decided to bring everything out, everything related to electric fuel pumps. You can see I've expanded the inventory here on the bench, and I'm going to address a few other issues. The first thing is I didn't have a dramatic shot of what happens literally when the pump sticks because of excessive varnish from old fuel. So I went back and I found another pump that I hadn't taken apart yet. I said, well, let's see if it even turns. And, applying 12 volts to this thing, nothing. Now see if they're free. They're going to spin like this. That pump is not moving. So, once again, it could be a burnout motor or worn brushes. But I would bet somebody $20 that if I take this plate off down here, we'll immediately find out why that pump motor is not spinning. This is the short pump, and let's see what we find when we pull this bottom plate off. One thing I want to warn you about is you have to be really careful when you pull these screws. They do tend to get corroded because of the location of this pump, so you don't want to break these off. If you break these off in this aluminum housing, they're almost impossible to tap out or drill out or rethread or whatever. So the first thing you want to do is soak them up with some good rust penetrant. Now I'll show you one that broke off, and you can see this is going to be a little bit of a challenge here on this long pump. The head of the screw broke off, and I might be able to get a hold of that with some vice grips and soak this up and even use a little heat and carefully get that broken screw out, because I don't want to break that off and leave it in the housing. So before you apply any type of a power tool to these screws, just make sure they're moving freely. This one's a little tight. Just rock them back and forth, make sure they're free. Okay, now I can bring in the power tool. Surprise. I almost can guarantee that you're going to see something really nasty here. Most of the time, the problem with these pumps are what you're going to see when I take this cover off. The rest of the problems are related to leaks, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But let's take a look here. Look at that. Now there's a dramatic example of what happens when old fuel sits in these pumps. Look at how it's just gelled up and made these ridges so the impeller can't even spin. And that's what obviously has got this pump stuck. But to make sure, let's go ahead and remove the impeller, and I'll try to apply the power to the motor again and see if it spins. Now another word of caution, when you're removing these impellers, don't try to pry them out. This is what happens when you try to pry them out. I'm sure somebody at one point tried to get in here and pry this out and broke these little impellers off. They're very fragile, okay? So just be real careful. I'm going to show you now what I do. I use a needle nose plier that has a wide jaw to it, and I'm going to come in here and just grab a hold of the sides. And I'm going to wiggle it, wiggle it, wiggle it, wiggle it, and lift it off, and carefully put that away. Now you see the inside of the pump. Obviously the seal is going to need to be replaced. But let's go ahead and apply power now and see if this pump spins. Look at that. It's got a nice sound to it. It's not grinding or scraping. So I believe this pump is going to be easily repairable. Now, it may require putting additional seals in it, because if you just replace this seal right here and put it back together, there's always a possibility it could leak up here, or it could leak right out through this contact plate. And that's really frustrating. So I have a complete reseal kit, which includes all the seals. So let's kind of talk about that now, and you can kind of decide whether you want to do that if you have one of these pumps and have it off the car. Because I tell you, when you get into these pumps, you know, the seals get old and swollen like this one, or they get hard like this one. And it's better to just replace all the seals if you have the pump off the car, because if it's not leaking fuel now, it probably will be in the future. And as far as cleaning off this old gummy fuel, varnish, or whatever you want to call it, just look at that. I have found that good old lacquer thinner works as well as anything else. If anything, you can just put it in the lacquer thinner like that, but it doesn't take much. The lacquer thinner will loosen that quite quickly, and it'll come off. So I'm going to let that soak a little bit more. See it just coming right off. We'll let that soak a little bit. But lacquer thinner also works very well for cleaning the outside of these pumps. Watch this. Just put the lacquer thinner on and let it soak. After letting it soak a little bit, you can bring in a little Scotch-Brite pad, lightly rub it. You don't want to scratch it, but just light rubbing. And you can actually make the pump look pretty nice when you do this. It's detailing 101, electric fuel pump. Okay, we're going to wipe that off. And you can see with some effort going all over this pump, I'm going to make this look pretty nice. But let's go back to this bottom plate now that's been soaking. See that? Look at how it just takes that off. And I try not to use anything on this bottom plate other than a brush. You notice this one's in pretty good shape. Some of these get heavier scratching in them, but this one has very little scratching. Of course, right where it seals, along that outer edge, I will take the Scotch-Brite pad and just clean that a little bit, because we want to make sure that rubber O-ring seals very well against the aluminum. So just a little bit of cleaning like this and a little bit of polishing right along this outer edge. Once again, I don't come in and polish the aluminum unless I have to. If I can get it all off with lacquer thinner and a brush, that's as far as I go. So I think that's enough on cleaning. You get the idea. Just going to take some time, but we're going to have this pump looking really nice. And when we reseal it, unless I find some problems internally with the motor, this is going to be a very nice pump and worth a lot of money. Now let's talk about this scratching that you see on the impellers and on these plates. And I'm going to share with you something I do on my cars to help prevent that. These type of scratches inside your pump are caused by contaminants in your fuel or fuel tank. And if it's real bad, these will get so deep that the pump loses its effectiveness. So you need to pay attention to this. If you're starting to see scratching like this in your pump, it usually means the tank is old, it's probably got some corrosion that eventually works its way into fuel and works its way down into the pump. Now, you got to remember, on these old Mercedes that use these styles of pump, the paper filter is way up at the engine compartment. So the only thing filtering the fuel before it gets to the pump is the tank screen here. And sometimes these tank screens will crack or split. Sometimes they'll break off, as you saw in the 4.5. And when that happens, there's no protection. The other problem is sometimes these screens will plug up if your tank is real rusty and the car will just quit. So what I've come up with is a filter to put between the fuel tank and the pump. And that's this filter right here. See that? You put that filter in line. You have to cut into the fuel hose coming out of the tank. I'm going to go over now and get under Happier and show you what this looks like in my 280 SL. And you can see that this filter is just sitting right in the middle of that main fuel hose running from the tank to the pump inlet. Now this does a couple things. It allows you to monitor how clean your tank is. It also gives you a quick and easy repair should you happen to plug the filter up. It's much easier to replace this filter than to drain the tank and clean or replace this fuel tank screen. Now, follow along here. I use a diesel fuel tank filter, which has a larger mesh, and that'll catch the large chunks. And then I use this filter, like you see in Happier, between the tank and the pump. And so I can just every once in a while, I can get under the car and look at this and visually see whether or not this is plugging up with junk. Now this is what I'm going to do on the 4.5 Beauty, because that tank's showing some signs of rust in it. So I'm going to put one of these, when I finally get it all tuned up and running right, I will replace the paper filter and I will install this. And we can monitor this over the next couple of months as we're driving the car to make sure that not a lot of rust is coming out of the fuel tank. So you can see the advantages of using a clear inline filter in these old fuel-injected cars. And what we have on my website is a kit like this. It comes with 2 filters, the correct size braided hose. We have to modify these filters so they fit tight in the hose, and clamps, high-quality clamps, because you want to make sure this does not come unfastened. I'll put a link in the description below this video that'll take you right to this kit if you have one of these old fuel-injected Mercedes. Fuel leaks coming out of these pumps can show up in a number of locations, and if you see this fuel pump leaking, you fix it. Don't drive the car with a leaking or weeping fuel pump. Now, we've already talked about the large O-ring that seals this bottom plate on this impeller housing, okay? That's fairly easy to get to. The others, not so easy. There's 6 O-rings total. You have 2 large ones, one here and one here, that seal this housing to the motor housing. As you go further into the motor, you can get to some of these other seals. You have a large fat seal that goes right here, okay? That one's pretty easy to do once you remove this housing from the motor housing. But you've also got a couple more seals. Now, somebody mentioned in the comments in the previous video, hey Kent, I've got fuel leaking out of here, right around the electrical contact area, and he wanted to know if that's repairable. Well, it is. It is repairable with the O-rings in my kit, but that requires you to start taking this whole motor assembly apart and even having to do some soldering. So what I've done is I've got 2 long videos that go through this whole procedure step by step on how to change all of the O-rings. There's another one here that fits between the motor and this housing here. And now I can show you where these other 2 smaller O-rings go. They go right here on this plastic. There's one on the red stud and one on the brown stud. And these would be the O-rings that failed that cause fuel to leak out of this area. If fuel is leaking out of here, then it's this O-ring that's causing the problem. So even though it takes a while to do this, I would recommend you get my full kit. We even include assembly lube and some dielectric grease. This stand will help you hold the motor while you're doing it, and some cleaning tools to clean the inside and outside of the pump. But I would recommend that you go ahead and reseal your entire pump, even though it may only be leaking out the bottom or not leaking at all because you pulled the bottom off to clean that impeller that I showed you earlier. Now there's another question that cropped up about fuel additives to prevent, this gumming problem. I want to address that now. I've got 5 gallons of ethanol-free. That's ethanol-free gasoline. You usually have to go to a special service station to get this. Now, if you can get aviation gasoline to put in your old Mercedes that doesn't get driven very often, that's even better. But that's expensive and generally hard to get. But if you can get ethanol-free gasoline, that's going to help on that varnish issue and gumming up your pump. So that's just a recommendation. If you can't get ethanol free, then put some additives in, including stable. You know, I recommend stable gasoline in all your vehicles, your lawnmower, your chainsaw, whatever, if you don't run it that often, and that'll help protect the carburetor and your fuel injection system, okay? So what I recommend is mixing some automatic transmission fluid into the gasoline to give the pump lubrication. Because you saw the scratching in there, there's virtually no lubrication in gasoline. So I prefer ATF. Now, a number of people said, well, Kent, what about Marvel Mystery Oil? Well, Marvel Mystery Oil has been around since 1923. And people have always thought this was some sort of snake oil, like, what's the mystery? They don't want to tell you what's in it, but it has passed the test of time, and there's a lot of people that really stand by this stuff. They think it's the greatest stuff. And I'm not going to criticize you if you like to use Marvel Mystery Oil. I'm not saying it's bad at all. But remember, Marvel Mystery Oil has some very strong cleaning agents in it. They're like paint thinners that help to clean out the gum in your hydraulic lifters or your fuel injectors. And that's not the purpose of the additive I want to add into Belvedere or Happier. What I'm interested in is adding an additive which has the highest concentration of lubrication that will stay, that won't drain away. Now, two-stroke motor oil is probably okay too. I'm not going to say that two-stroke motor oil is bad either. But I prefer the properties of old Dexron ATF, okay? And what I'm going to do now with this 5 gallons of gasoline is I'm going to add a small amount. Now, you don't want to add a lot or your engine's going to smoke and you'll probably foul the spark plugs. You just want to add enough so residually it'll be lubricating the injection pump and the fuel pump. Now, normally I add 4 ounces for every 10 gallons of gasoline. And that's pretty standard. I think Marvel Mystery Oil probably recommends about the same amount. 4 ounces per 10 gallons of gas. But because poor old Belvedere hasn't run in a while, I'm going to double that up. I'm going to put 4 ounces of ATF in 5 gallons of gasoline and then put it in my old Ponton and fire it up. So there you have it. I'm going to pour that into that. I'm going to shake it up. I like adding it to a fuel can if I can because I can really get it shaken up if you're not going to be driving the car. Obviously, if you put it in, you take off and head off down the freeway. You don't have to worry about shaking it up. But there's one thing you need to understand here. This is my opinion, okay? It's like people see this stuff on YouTube and they say, oh yeah, that's got to be the greatest. Somebody said this and this and this. Well, I'm sure if somebody got on YouTube and said that chicken soup in your engine oil would absolutely solve noisy lifters, somebody would probably believe it and somebody would probably try it. So I don't have years of scientific proof on tearing engines and fuel pumps apart to determine whether Marvel Mystery Oil, two-stroke oil, or transmission fluid is better than the other, and neither does anybody else. So when you hear all this stuff like, well, this oil is better than this, and I've had this old timer, he's used it this, and you know, use what you want. It's your car. But please don't get on YouTube and tell somebody what they're using is bad and what you're using is better when you really don't have any proof. So I hope that clarified some of those questions from part 1. I'm going to go out now and put this fuel in my old 220 SE Ponton. Now somebody asked, was that a fuel injected engine? Yes, that is one of the very rare fuel injected engines in an old Ponton 220 sedan. If my memory serves me right, I think they only made about 1,800 sedans with the fuel injected engine in it. So good old Belvedere, you know, is a very, very rare car. And in conclusion, somebody said, well, why do you have to name all your cars? Well, stay tuned. I'm going to shoot a video tomorrow explaining why, the key reason why I name all my cars.